Hey, what's up, you amazing hackers? Hope you're all doing well. So let's talk about the PTS pre-engagement steps, shall we? Because I think this is something super important. And like they say themselves, this is not talked about often enough. This is what you have to do before you start your attack. So this is one of their 7 phases. We'll look into the others later as well. But let's start with scope, because for them, they say if your scope is not well defined, scope creep can be a real issue, and we'll get deeper into scope creep later. What it basically means is that you have a specific project and you have a scope set in mind, but you keep adding on features and you keep adding on features until it gets unmanageable. That is scope creep, basically. We'll get more into it later, like I said, and then there's also legal trouble that can come from a undefined scope, and also unsatisfied customers as well, of course. That's the main thing that we are testing for. Then, when it comes to time estimation, this is largely based on the experience of a tester. This will often be a very high level estimation, and when you're done creating your estimation, usually you add a 20% buffer, and when a tester is a bit more experienced, he can look back at previous projects as well, at his mailbox that reports that he's written before, test plans. They all help create a better understanding of what testing might need to be done. And if your buffer is not needed in the end, if it turns out to be too much, well, that's okay, just don't bill it then. We just have to make sure that for time estimations we define a clear end date. Then for the scoping meeting basically takes place after the contract signing. The scope is already defined at this point. So now we are scoping in on that. This takes place after the contract is signed again. So this means that there's already a rough estimation of what we want to test. And in here, we're going to discuss that, what we want to test. We're going to see if what we've assumed during our estimations is correct here. And we're also going to determine if there are any geographic laws that we have to take into account. Then we can also incur additional hourly charges, or at least our client can, but you have to be very careful with that. They might ask you, hey, can you test this other thing? And it might add on some charges hourly, might add in some extra hours to the contract. All of that is great and all, but the problems are that scope creep, you should charge it, of course, but it might not be documented properly. And it might also contain incomplete risk analysis, also legal risk analysis, of course. That's not good. So be careful. You can, of course, add on additional hours, but make sure that all of the previous steps aren't rushed through just to get it out there, just to add it onto the contract. Then, as for questionnaires, there will be a list of questionnaires in the course, and this is a good time to mention that if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm creating a course about this as well. Link will be in the description below. If you're watching this in the course, there will be additional documentation in the course which contains questionnaires that you will have to go over with your clients to make sure that you've covered everything. I'll go over those separately as well. Then, as for scope creep, we all know what it is now, but how do you react when it happens? A lot of managers don't know this, and that brings them into hot water. Of course, when people ask us for additional work, as a pen tester, you should take it as a compliment. You should be very flattered that people want to hire you again because they're very happy with your work, otherwise, they wouldn't hire you again. That also means that you shouldn't be afraid to ask for compensation before you start, because they want you back. They do. But be sure to treat your existing customers well. Do that always and give them a discount or something, because you will value those long-term relationships in the end. It's long-term, steadier work, which is much better than a contract here, a contract there. It's much better to have steady long-term relationships in this business. Now you also want to specify a start and an end date. Specify it very carefully and validate it, always validate it before attacking, because otherwise you might be attacking outside of your window of attack, and that's going to be a problem again. The work is not paid for until it's done. That's something that you have to keep in mind. So this includes retests as well. Of course, you can offer retests because it shows that you care about your customer, but make sure that you add a simple time box to that as well, so that you don't go outside of your allotted budget either. As for third parties, always be aware of those third parties. Make sure that you look at the cloud providers, ISPs, MSSPs, country laws. All of these third-party integrations should be taken care of, especially, for example, cloud providers. A lot of people will integrate with a cloud provider but will misconfigure it, and then they are wide open to an attack. Besides that, of course, you need to take into account as well that all of these third parties need to agree with what you're doing. Don't just start attacking a cloud provider if you're not allowed to do that. When it comes to social engineering, it's been proven time and time again that the best way to get somebody to fall for social engineering is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So make sure that you know that, but also make sure that your client knows that those are effective, but if they say don't use that, if it's inappropriate in the current context, then don't, of course. Make sure that you always talk about these things with your client. As for denial of service attack testing, everybody's favorite, make sure that you request permissions, because you're going to be stress testing a system and you don't want to be the one bringing it down when production is at its prime time. Payment terms, that's a difficult one. Well, a difficult one, not really, in a sense that you just have to make sure that you know that usually it's 30 days after the report has been delivered. That is when the payment is usually followed, or at least that is the payment period that has been granted to the client. But you can change that. Of course, you can make that 60 days if that's a custom for you. You can make it shorter if that's a custom for where you are. It really depends. Usually there is a fine incurred, a percentage of the original amount per month that there is no payment. Now, recurring payments are an option. Usually long-term engagements request recurring payments, or at least the pen testing companies request recurring payments from long-term engagements, because of course they have their bills as well. They need to pay them as well. And they usually can't wait half a year to a year before they can get paid. A deposit might be agreed upon in that case as well, and that can even be up to 50% of the bill. It really depends. As for goals, we have three types of goals. The primary goals, which is really business organization focused. You don't really care about compliance at that point, and you're really thinking, what is the impact here for my client? What can I do for them? Then your secondary goals will focus on those compliance issues, and your business goals, those are the last goals. Of course, you're going to look at if you can serve the business with anything, business logic flaws, for example. When it comes to lines of communication, make sure that you always have some emergency contact information at hand. Make sure that, for example, when a server or system goes down, that you have some contact information, somebody who you can contact, who you can call, and so that the production environment isn't down for a whole weekend, for example. All pen testers must be noted in the lines of communication as well. All test managers, same for them. Now, I always include 2 technical contacts at least from my client side, and also every sub-organization. If it's a big organization with multiple sub-organizations, I include 2 tech contacts from each sub-organization that I'm attacking, And then also one person from upper management or business contacts. Those are also possible. When it comes to incident reporting, make sure that you think of incident response as well, because a lot of people don't really know what to do when they get attacked, and that is something you should always ask your client. Are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about incident response? Define what an incident is as well to them, so you know what it's. We all know what it means. They in PTES use the NIST definition. I like that as well. An incident is a violation or imminent threat of violation of computer security policies, acceptable use policies, or standard security practices. For the status reports, there should be noted that there's a frequency of reporting, and it should be agreed upon between the client and the pen tester. This frequency and manner of reporting should be defined beforehand as well, and it's usually based on the length of the engagement, because there's no use in holding a weekly status meeting if your engagement only lasts 2 weeks, unless you only want to have one, of course. Then also very important, don't chronically postpone these status reports, because that doesn't look professional, and it looks even more unprofessional if you skip them completely. Especially if this becomes a chronic thing. Don't do that, your client matters a lot. When it comes to your client mattering a lot, of course, their data and their trade secrets do as well. So we want to communicate securely, and we want to have their data stored securely as well. We always want to use PGP to communicate if possible. And then we want to add passwords to a file or put it in an AEG encrypted zip file. Secure your mailboxes, all of them, from your client, and make sure that you are from your side, and make sure that your client's side is also secure. Don't text, preferably pick up the phone and call. It will give you a first sense if something's wrong. If you're talking to a different person, you might hear it in their voice, versus texting where you have no contextual feedback at all. And of course, face-to-face is a preferred, because in that way you make sure that you have the right person in front of you. Now, as for the rules of engagement, we should talk a little bit about that as well. This is defining how to hack instead of what to hack. And in this we include timelines, location timelines. I mean, when do we test, of course, start and end date. When do we plan to deliver the report, those kinds of things. Locations. Where are we hacking? Physical locations, could be network locations. Evidence handling, if you find something, like for example a file, how should you store it, what should you do with it. The status meetings should be discussed in the rules of engagement as well. And then we have the time of day of testing. When are you gonna test? Sometimes the companies prefer that you test at night, for example. And then your permissions to test. This is arguably one of the most important documents, because this states that you do have permission to test, and it can help with legal considerations as well. That's a whole mouthful for PTES, but I think it defines very well what to do in the pre-engagement of a pen test. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, my dear friends.